Tuning into podcast is one of the great things about the internet. They add a whole new dimension to the interactive experience of the web, and you can create some of your own as well. Recording a podcast is pretty easy if you have the right equipment. Of course, you can do some pretty sophisticated things like sound effects and background music, but here's a super brief overview for starters. Make sure you have these things: a microphone, a computer with an audio card, drivers to run the hardware, and recording software. Your computer may have a microphone built in, or your system may have come with an external mic. If neither of these is the case, you can buy a microphone at any major electronics store. An external mic has to be plugged in, so look for the right jack on your computer and do that. Then set the mic in a comfortable spot on your desk. If you're using a laptop, the built-in mic is probably close to the edge of the keyboard or near the speakers. Next, make sure your computer has an audio card and the drivers to run the hardware. Some desktop PCs come with a no-frills audio card, so check the manual and make sure it can handle basic voice recording. And finally, you need recording software. Odds are you already have some audio recording software on your computer, like Record It for the PC, or iMovie and GarageBand for the Mac. If you don't have software, you can visit audacity.sourceforge.net and download a free audio recording program called Audacity. Okay, so your computer's all set up, your mic is working, you've got the hardware and the software. Now it's showtime. Depending on your podcasts, for example, if it's a business marketing tool versus entertainment, you may want to jot down some bullet points or even a complete script. You don't want to sound like you're reading, but you do want to hit all the high points of your message. Also, make sure you know what your sign-off will be. Something like, "Thanks for listening," or "I'll see you next week." Figuring out how to close can be kind of awkward if you haven't prepped something in advance. You probably don't want to go more than 10 minutes for your first recording. 10 minutes may seem like an eternity, but it will fly by once you get on a roll. Let's record something. Click the record button on your software and start talking. And click the stop button when you're done with your notes. As soon as you're done recording, before you do anything else, make sure you save your file. Just click File, choose Save As, and give the project a name. If you're using an application other than Audacity, you might have to turn your recording into an MP3 file. Because of their smaller file size, MP3s download more quickly than other audio file formats and are ideal for podcasting. A lot of built-in audio players let you create MP3s, but if your system doesn't read or compress recordings to MP3 format, you can download the iTunes software for free from www.apple.com/iTunes. Okay, now the critical last step. Just because you've created an audio file doesn't mean you created a podcast. The name podcast implies that your file is being broadcast, so you've got to post it online where your audience can find and listen to the recording. To get your recording out to the masses, you'll have to upload your audio file to a website or blog by transferring the audio file to your web server like you would any other piece of content you put on your site. One common misconception about podcasts is that you load your audio files directly to podcatcher sites like iTunes, podcast.com, or podcastalley.com. A podcatcher site is simply a directory of podcasts. To get your podcast listed on a podcatcher, you have to submit the location of your podcast manually. The final step in uploading a podcast is to create a specially formatted text file, usually XML, which stands for Extensible Markup Language, and move it up to your web server with your audio file. This file allows listeners to automatically subscribe to your podcast and helps your podcatcher sites automatically update your listing whenever you post a new episode. Once this file is loaded to the server along with your audio file, you register the URL for the location of this file with the podcatchers. The special format you use for your text is called RSS 2.0. Don't let all these terms fool you. The XML feed is just a basic text document that provides critical information about your podcast, most importantly, where the audio recording file is located. The document also contains a brief description of the podcast and search terms, which are then indexed by each podcatcher you register with. So when someone goes to iTunes or a similar site and searches for a topic, these terms will help them find your podcast. And once they do find your podcast, the description gives them a brief summary of the podcast and individual episodes so they can preview before downloading. But remember, you have to manually submit your podcast URL to each podcatcher in order for it to show up in their search results. Listeners to your podcast can also subscribe to your show by placing a link to the podcast feed in their podcatching client. Just list the URL on your web page, like this, with some brief instructions. This all sounds really complicated, but I promise you it's not. If you need additional assistance with how to create podcast content, how to record your podcast, or how to create the associated files you need to push your podcast out to a wider audience, take a look at the latest edition of Podcasting for Dummies for help.